Okay, here we are to the final period in AP European history. We are looking at 1914, obviously beginning of World War I through present. That's why it's called Global Wars Through Globalization. So the First World War, the causes of the war were numerous and depending on the places that you were looking at. So there were quite a few political and social tensions throughout Europe. So in Britain and Ireland, Irish nationalist forces were pressing for independence. They'd been calling for home rule since 1860, the Irish overwhelmingly Catholic at the time. Irish Unionists, though, wanted to remain part of Great Britain, and they are overwhelmingly Protestant. So unionism grew around the Protestant areas in north of Ireland, especially the province of Ulster. Britain and France are also impacted by the growing number of labor conflicts due to overall stagnation of wages. In France, we can look at some political tensions going on there. One is the Dreyfus Affair in 1894. A Jewish officer was falsely accused of telling military secrets to the Germans. This reveals the anti-Semitism of Germany at the time. There are questions about the role of the Catholic Church in democratic France. There is increased open hostility to the Catholic Church, which is considered to be anti-Republican. They passed laws that eliminated the church from primary and secondary education and try to deal with that. In Russia, they lost the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. The Tsar is bankrupt due to the cost of this conflict. This led to the revolution of 1905, where there was an effort to transform Russia into a constitutional monarch. Tsar Nicholas II at first agreed, but was slow to initiate some of those reforms, and finally went back on the idea of the Duma and the idea of a constitutional monarch. In Germany and Austria-Hungary, war was a means to escape their bleak domestic political situation. In Germany, worker agitation was on the rise, and they were concerned there would be a socialist revolution. Austria-Hungary was fraught with different issues with nationalities. You have the Magyars in Hungary, which wanted, the dominance of their own language and their own culture throughout their region of Hungary, which caused quite a bit of hostility for the other nationalities that lived there. And then you have entangling alliances. In 1879, Bismarck created the Dual Alliance as a military treaty with Austria-Hungary. He signed a reassurance policy with Russia in 1887 to say Austria-Hungary, their alliance was only defensive in nature, and it would not be used as a hostile intent towards Russia in order to avoid war on two fronts. But when Kaiser Wilhelm II takes power and fires Bismarck, the Russians begin to view the Germans as dangerous, and Wilhelm II does not renew the reassurance treaty in 1890. So the Russians were going to join the French in a military alliance to protect themselves. And that now puts possible enemies on both sides of Germany, the exact thing that Bismarck wanted to avoid. In 1904, Great Britain signs the Entente Cordiale with France to try to resolve colonial issues, thereby putting Great Britain and France also in an alliance with one another. So we see those political tensions. We also see, though, increased militarization. The Kaiser built a high seas fleet in 1897, and that was seen as a threat to the British. The Germans built powerful new ships they called dreadnoughts, making the British fleet obsolete, and the rivalry between Great Britain and Germany became openly hostile. The production of vast stores of weapons by all powers dramatically increased tensions. And then finally, we have obviously that crisis in the Balkans. June 28th, 1914 in Sarajevo. In Bosnia, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb. He was a member of the Black Hand, a secret Serbian nationalist group with ties to both the army and the government. Now, the Balkans had already brought Europe to the brink of war in 1908 when Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina from the Ottomans, who were weak and could not defend the land. The annexed lands, they did this in order to try to keep them out of the hands of the Serbians, who the Austrian-Hungarians feared with their rise of power. For the course of the war, we see July 28th, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia vows to protect Serbia. Austria-Hungary has the backing of Germany. Germany has provided what we call a quote-unquote blank check. Many feel Germany was the only power that could have restrained Austria-Hungary during this time. Russia began mobilization, and Germany demanded that Russia stop. Russia refused, so Germany then declared war on Russia. France began to mobilize, which then caused Germany to declare war on France. The parties of the Second Internationale, who had claimed they would not support capitalist European wars and spoke of quote unquote international brotherhood, actually vowed in each of their nations to support the war. One of the few socialists who did speak out was French Socialist Party leader Jean Jaurès, but he was shot on the eve of the war by a French nationalist who hated his pacifism. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the war due to the incorrect belief that the war would be short. This was due to the quick conflicts like the Austrian-Prussian War of 1866 and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, both of which only lasted a few weeks. But new weapons would cause this war to last such a long time. Weapons like machine guns, barbed wire, mines, more powerful artillery shells, and the introduction of airplanes. The Germans began the war by implementing the Schieffelin Plan. This relied on the rapid advance through northern France, with the belief that France could be knocked out of the war in 6 weeks, and then Germany could use the railroads to defeat Russia to the east. The German plan required the invasion of Belgium. So this brought Great Britain into the war in order to defend the Belgian people. And then this greatly upset the United States. The Germans crossed the Marne River, but the French army under General Joffre counterattacked and stopped the Germans at the First Battle of the Marne. By the first winter, both sides held positions that would remain virtually unchanged on the western part of the war. Trench warfare pretty much existed throughout this. These were huge networks of defensive fortifications where life was just a series of horrors, rats chewing on dead bodies, noise from artillery, and extreme boredom, and those calls to be sent over the top into no man's land. In 1915, poison gas began to be used by both sides, which was developed in effect because of the Second Industrial Revolution. The war in the East was fought by brave but poorly equipped Russians. Attempting to break the stalemate in the East, the British launched an attack on Turkey, which had sided with the Central Powers. Winston Churchill at this time served as First Lord of the Admiralty, and he created a plan that was such a disaster it almost ended his political career. In April 1915, 5 divisions landed on the beach of Gallipoli, but the Turks were so well dug in, it failed. In 1916, the Germans launched massive offensives against the French fortress of Verdun, but the French were able to defend them under General Philippe Pétain. He survived the battle to later become the disgraced leader of the defeated Vichy French in 1940. And this was one of the most costly battles of the war. The Battle of the Somme and the Battle of the Passchendaele were both attempts by the British and French to break German lines, but both of those were also disastrous. In 1917, a revolution is going to hit Russia. It is the Bolshevik Revolution. And we are going to see leaders of the new Bolshevik state sue Germany for peace. On April 8th, 1917, the United States enters the war due to things like the Zimmermann telegraph that was intercepted and the use of unrestricted German submarine warfare, sinking numerous ships such as the Lusitania and the Arabic. In 1918, the Germans tried to go on the offensive but failed and ended up in retreat. The German High Command informed the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, that Germany needed to end this war. The new German government is now led by Prince Max von Baden, a moderate, who contacted the United States President Woodrow Wilson and asked for an armistice. Wilson produces his 14 points, an idealistic document that says that this will reduce further tensions. Soldiers and workers in Germany began forming Soviets, and many, fearing that they would follow Russia's example, finally convinced the Kaiser to abdicate and create a republic. And the armistice is signed November 11th, 1918. World War I was the first armed struggle to have complete mobilization of the society as a whole. We call this total war. All national resources were mobilized, and this was a major factor that allowed the increase of the role of government during the 20th century. All aspects of the economy were regulated to support the war, including price controls, the banning of strikes, rationing, and the planned use of all national resources. Censorship became the basic task of all government leaders as they read and censored letters from all soldiers. Governments set up propaganda offices to create films and posters to boost morale. The Second World War in the United States helped, eventually we will talk about the Second World War. I don't know why I have this here, but anyway, prior to the war, Great Britain saw an expanding female suffrage movement. Women, both working through social and political unions known as the suffragettes, they were led by Emmeline Pankhurst, who supported the war and encouraged women to do their share. And at the end of the war, they are going to be rewarded with that right to vote in 1918. So what is the end effect of the war? 9 million men die in battle and 23 million are wounded. Germany has 6 million casualties alone, France 5.5 million. But interestingly enough, the Spanish flu, influenza going around, claimed 30 million lives, way more than any that died in this battle. The economic costs were unprecedented as hundreds of towns and villages in France and Belgium were destroyed. The nations of Europe that were creditors to the rest of the world are now heavily in debt to the United States. The only country of kind of the industrialized world left that has a fully functioning economy. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace says the war's actual cost is around $338 billion. 5 separate peace settlements were reached at the peace conference in the end that took place in Paris, with the first and of course the most famous being the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed June 1919. Now, Woodrow Wilson wanted to reshape the world based on his 14 points. He wanted to allow for self-determination. He wanted to end colonies. He wanted to create a League of Nations. Remember, none of the fighting had taken place in the United States, and US loss of life paled compared to that of France and Britain. The French Georges Clemenceau, this is a nation that suffered greatly. Well, he wanted to satisfy a French public to ensure that Germany would never be a threat again. And Prime Minister David Lloyd George from Great Britain also wanted to see Germany punished. The Allies included something called Article 231, which forced Germany to accept all responsibility for the outbreak of the war. We often refer to this as the War Guilt Clause. They also were levied with huge reparations, 132 billion gold marks, and it was supposed to be given to the Entente powers. They also had a clause in the peace agreement that had stated they had to return Alsace-Lorraine to France. And there would be the occupation of French troops in parts of Germany on the western bank of the Rhine, a strip of land that was to remain demilitarized. France maintained economic control over the coal and iron mines of the Saar Valley for 15 years. Germany's army was allowed to be no larger than 100,000 men. They were banned from an air force, and they could maintain only a very small navy to protect their coastal waters. During this time, Czechoslovakia was created out of the lands of the Czechs and Slovaks, with a significant number of Germans scattered in that will play important for World War II. Hungary was reduced in size, but was created to be fully independent at this point. An independent Romania was carved out of the former Austrian-Hungarian lands. Serbia was granted additional lands, leading to the creation of Yugoslavia. That will be important later. And an independent Poland is created for the very first time since the 18th century. Finally, Finland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were carved out of former parts of the Russian Empire. So what's happening in Russia? Well, Russian soldiers were thrown into battle without guns, and they had to pick those rifles from their fallen comrades, revealing the complete incompetence of Tsar Nicholas II. In year 2 of the war, Tsar Nicholas assumed personal command of the army, and that was also not a very smart idea. In his absence, he left his wife, Empress Alexandra, in charge, and she came under the influence of a Russian monk named Gregory Rasputin. He encouraged the Empress to place his friends in important state offices, even though they were incompetent. Rumors began to spread that Alexandra and Rasputin were lovers, and the German-born Empress was trying to make sure Russia was in fact defeated in World War I. Similar rumors were spread about the British royal family, who had German roots, so they actually changed their family name from Saxe-Coburg to the more English-sounding Windsor. In 1916, Rasputin is killed by a group of monarchists worried about his influence. Well, in the end, we see that Russia faces not one, but 2 revolutions in 1917. One is in March, one is in October. So in March 1917, in the city of Petrograd, the city is dealing with severe food shortages. The troops are called out to disperse the crowd, but are joined with strikers. In March 1917, the Tsar abdicates and a provisional government takes over, which is made up of members of the Duma. They're supposed to only be in power long enough to write a new constitution for the new Russian Republic. Workers and soldiers, though, continued to form Soviets, which consisted of Russian socialists, and the majority of which belonged to the Mensheviks. There were some socialist revolutionary wings, and a minority belonged to the Bolsheviks. Now, way back in 1903, Vladimir Lenin said a small party of professional revolutionaries could seize power, and his leaders are the people that we refer to as the Bolsheviks. Those in Russia felt they had to go through proven historical stages before they could reach ideal socialism, and those are the people we refer to the Mensheviks. And they were the ones that dominated the Soviet Petrograd at the time, the Petrograd Soviet at the time. They were those who initially supported the provisional government because it fit with the idea that there would be a bourgeoisie revolution. And that was what was needed before there would be a socialist revolution. But the short-lived Russian Republic faced many problems. The provisional government decided to remain in World War I instead of withdrawing because they felt responsible to the other parties. They also decided to delay the redistribution of the great estates to the peasants. So the peasants are going to begin to act on their own initiative, and they are going to begin to seize land. So in April, Lenin returns from exile from Switzerland. He's actually aided by the Germans who sneak him through on a train because they were trying to undermine the Russian war effort. The Bolsheviks continued to build their strength, especially among workers and soldiers. And by the fall of 1917, the Bolsheviks are the largest party. Lenin decided to seize power, and on November 9th, the new Bolshevik figurehead, Leon Trotsky, rode the momentum of his party's electoral success to take key positions in the city. The revolution happened really without a lot of violence, as the provisional government sort of just collapsed. But the violence now will happen over the next 3 years, as the Bolsheviks cope with a civil war to try to maintain power. Lenin and his party believed the Russian Revolution was the first in a series of communist revolutions that would move to the rest of Europe. So they were willing to accept peace with Germany because they believed Germany would soon disappear. They signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which removed Russia from the war. They were harsh during this time because we see that the Germans confiscated a large part of Russian land. But this was really never fully implemented because Germany was defeated in the war. All right, Germany during the interwar years. So in 1918, we see the creation of the Weimar Republic, and it's first led by Friedrich Ebert, a moderate socialist. He put out a rebellion led by radical Marxists like Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and secured a Republican regime. In order to secure his Republican regime, unfortunately, he was forced to rely on old imperial officers. Now, the army was not in a position to put down the rebellion by themselves, so Ebert gave approval for the formation of something they called the Free Corps. This was a voluntary paramilitary group with extreme right-wing leanings. In 1920, some of the Free Corps tried to overthrow the democratic state, but a general strike of workers put an end to what became known as the Kapp Putsch. By 1920, it's clear that while the threat from the left was gone, the far right was actually an even greater threat. In 1923, the Chancellor of Germany, Gustav Stresemann, was the leader of the German People's Party, a conservative party that supported the Weimar Republic and was able to get the economy back on its feet, including working out new reparations agreements, making it less damaging to Germany's economy. In 1934, the Republic had some degree of stability, but suffered from terrible inflation. So they printed more and more money, which led to very high inflation. In fact, at one point, 11 trillion marks was equal to a single US dollar. And because of that, the middle class loses all their wealth. The following year, in 1925, Germany signs the Locarno Agreement with France, accepting the current borders between France and Germany and French control over Alsace-Lorraine, which begins the withdrawal of French troops from the Rhineland. And in 1926, Germany and the Weimar Republic joins the League of Nations. Now, the communists in Russia are working to solidify control over Russia during this time. For 3 years, they fought a struggle against the White Forces. Now, the White Forces is a very loose term we use for various anti-communist factions, including dedicated monarchs and Republicans, who would get their support from both the British and the Americans. The Civil War was a justification for Lenin and Trotsky to launch what is called the Red Terror against opponents, including right-wing extremists and other socialists like the Mensheviks. Fascist ideas are going to sweep across Europe. So in 1919, Russian communists founded a third or Communist International to aid this revolution. And we also often refer to this as the Comintern. By 1920, they defeat the various white armies and they establish Bolshevik rule over Russia. The majority of socialists were horrified by the repressive nature of Lenin, and this led to a split in Europe between those who formed communist parties and those who stayed the tide to socialist parties. In Germany, they split within the left, and this allowed the rise of the Nazis, as the German communists thought the Social Democratic Party was more of a threat to them than the Nazis. When it was clear that revolution was not going to spread to other parts of Europe, the Russians began to look internally at issues with their own country. During the Civil War, they imposed war communism, or tight control over all aspects of the economy. But in 1921, the harshness of this led to rebellion at the Kronstadt naval base, which was a Bolshevik stronghold. The rebellion was crushed with brutality, and Lenin decided to replace war communism with his new economic policy, or NEP, which put industry in government hands, but allowed private enterprise for small businesses, and the economy began to recover some. Unfortunately, Lenin dies quickly after that, and many question who will succeed him. One candidate was Leon Trotsky, who had built the Red Army and won the Civil War, but he thought the NEP was too ideologically compromised and wanted to return to true war communism. He was the leader of the left opposition, and he also argued they needed to spread revolution to the nations of the West. He was opposed to Nikolai Bukharin, the right opposition leader who advocated the NEP in building communism in the Soviet state. And Bukharin had an ally, and his name was Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin joined the party in 1902, but really had a minor role in taking power in November of 1917. He didn't care about ideological debates, but worked with Bukharin to maneuver Trotsky out of power. And in 1927, Trotsky is expelled from the Communist Party. 2 years later, Stalin ousts Bukharin, and beginning in 1936, launches a series of show trials where his former opponents are tortured until they confess to crimes against the state. Close to 10 million Russians are arrested in the 1930s, and several million are executed immediately or die in the detention camps of Siberia. Call this the Purge, or the Great Purge. He decimated the ranks of the old Bolsheviks, destroyed his officer corps, and killed anyone he thought was disloyal to the state or himself. In fact, in 1940, he sent an assassin to kill Trotsky in Mexico. He began a program to rapidly industrialize Russia in 1928 that he called the 5-year plan, and paid for this by taking money from the peasants through forced collectivization of Russian agriculture. He waged open war on the kulaks, or wealthy peasants, and sent party cadres to the countryside with the order to kill any peasant who would not join the collective farm. Millions were shot or died from starvation after they destroyed their own crops and farm animals, rather than turn them over to the communists. We believe up to 10 million died in the countryside, as Stalin moved all the crops they grew to urban areas. Now, all of this is impacted by the Great Depression. In May 1931, the collapse of Vienna's most powerful bank, Credit Anstalt, created a domino effect. Banks throughout Germany and Eastern Europe started to fail. People withdrew their savings, which depleted available reserves, and banks folded. Banks stopped making loans, so individuals started saving all their money, which created a drop in demand for industrial goods, which meant a drop in jobs. So unemployment just further repressed the demand for goods. Trying to remain on the gold standard, which was a fixed exchange rate between currencies, meant countries couldn't use controlled inflation to get them out of a depression. Inflation discouraged people from saving too much because their money would be worth less in the future than it would be today. It was made worse because there was a common belief that to fix a depression, you just further tighten the money supply until bad loans go bust and failed companies go out of business. Governments also tried to stop their spending to balance their budgets, which just further suppressed the demand for goods and led to even more unemployment. Now, English economist John Maynard Keynes is a singular voice of dissent to this idea. And he said the problem was a lack of demand in the private sector, so governments could fix it by deficit spending or priming the pump. This is made even worse when governments raised tariff barriers like the United States did in 1930. By 1932, the economies of Europe are performing at only half of their 1929 level, And the countries hardest hit are the United States and Germany. In the United States, a stable democracy under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and whose New Deal is going to be used to fight the Depression. But in Germany, a shaky democracy will result in the death of Republican institutions and a triumph for fascism. Fascism comes from a Latin term fasces, which is a small bundle of sticks carried by Romans as a symbol of authority and community. This is symbolic of the central goal to destroy the notion of the individual and to push for a common community. It sounds similar to communism and the idea of a unified society devoid of class differences. But instead, it does not advocate for the end of class distinctions. It wants ideology rooted in extreme nationalism and a mystical racial heritage, such as Volkisch ideology pursued by the German fascists. They hated the idea of parliamentary democracy and instead favored the idea of a strong leader. The Italian fascists had El Duce and the Germans had Das Fuhrer, who represented all the desires and dreams of the nation. But both these men will gain power through voting, not through an armed coup. Fascists despised democracy and rejected socialism. They saw themselves as the antidote to Soviet collectivism, and this would help them rise to power. Middle-class individuals were aware that Soviets had collectivized all private property and saw fascism as a barrier to communism. Mussolini promised that an Italian fascist state would implement corporatism, where an association of employers and workers within each industry would iron out all contentious issues regarding production and wages. Fascists were against political emancipation of women. They hated modern art, and they despised Judaism. When we look at fascism in Italy, it is the first state to have a fascist government because it actually happened prior to the Great Depression, and it was not a financial devastation that caused this movement. It happened in Italy due to deep dissatisfaction with their participation in World War I. Their military participation was initially disastrous, leading to an almost total collapse of the Italian front in 1917. But they did remain in the war, and eventually they were part of the victors of World War I. It was costly, but many thought they would get gains at the peace table and they would get parts of the collapsed Austro-Hungarian Empire. At the end of the war, they felt they should have gotten more land for their participation. And so they went through a period of political transformation. In 1919, they adopted proportional representation, where parties would be rewarded seats in the legislature on the basis of their percentage in national votes. This system favored the creation of mass parties, like Mussolini's fascist movement. Between 1919 and 1920, there was a series of factory occupations by angry workers pushing for communism. Leading landowners and businessmen began to turn against democratic policies, and they were looking for another solution, which they found in fascism. Founder and leader of Italian fascism was Benito Mussolini, whose father was actually a socialist. Mussolini at first was a socialist too, an editor of the party newspaper, but his views began to shift during World War I, when he supported Italy's entrance into the war, and he served. Mussolini founded a new party, the Nationalist Fascist Party, which formed a paramilitary squad called the Black Shirts to fight leftist organizations and earned the gratitude of factory owners and landowners who paid off the party. By 1921, he began to seat members in the Italian parliament. With only a few seats in the legislature on October 1922, Mussolini demanded that King Victor Emmanuel III name him and other fascist cabinet posts and organize the Black Shirts to march on Rome to seize power. If the king had declared martial law and brought the army in, the fascists would have scattered. But the king was timid and was not unsympathetic to the fascists. So he named Mussolini prime minister, and the march on Rome really turned into a celebration instead of a coup. Mussolini implemented a number of constitutional changes to end democracy and consolidate his power. In fact, he banned all non-fascist political activity. Mussolini found it hard, though, to create an Italy in a fascist image. And instead of getting a revolution, he had to make peace with established institutions like the Catholic Church. In 1929, he signed the Lateran Pact with the papacy, where the papacy officially recognized the Italian state, and the Italian state officially made Catholicism the religion of Italy. In Germany, we see the collapse of the Republic beginning in the very first years of the Great Depression. The Weimar Republic was not helped by the fact the president was a former military general. His name was Paul von Hindenburg. He was a dedicated monarchist who actually, prior to running for president in 1925, actually contacted the former emperor in exile in Denmark to ask his approval to run for office. President Hindenburg used the resignation of the socialist chancellor to install a more authoritative government and selected Heinrich Brüning, a leader of the middle-of-the-road Catholic Party. Brüning proposed an economic program that did little to solve the economic crisis and just led to even more political opposition on the left and the right. Brüning couldn't achieve a majority, so then he invoked Article 48, an emergency decree within the Weimar Constitution that let him govern with just presidential decree. In September 1930, he called for new parliamentary elections, thinking the government would back him on austerity measures. But instead, the Nazis emerged as the winners, going from 12 seats to 102. Brüning continued to use Article 48 for the next 2 years, but his austerity programs only worsened the economy. In 1932, Hindenburg removed Brüning and replaced him with Franz von Papen, an anti-parliamentarian conservative, and the Nazis became the largest party in the German Reichstag. By 1933, Hindenburg asked Hitler to become chancellor. He was a man who had been living in Vienna and while there developed his anti-Semitic beliefs. During World War I, he served for Germany, even though he was born into the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in Vienna. But he did not like its multinational character. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, which was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Why the Nazis? During the Depression, they championed moderate socialist rhetoric like increased wages. They provided soup kitchens, and they denounced communism. They also indulged the people's desires on whom to blame for the loss of World War I and their condition. Hitler in 1923 launched the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. It failed, and he was put on trial. In prison for his 1-year sentence, he wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his extremist views. Then he decided to use the existing political structure to gain power instead of a coup. He also enlisted a group of armed thugs to support their political rallies and disrupt people opposing group meetings, which would lead to increased violence. The Nazi regime of January 1933 marks the final stage in the collapse of the Weimar Republic. In 1933, Hitler moved to consolidate power. The Reichstag building in Berlin was caught afire. Many blame the communists, but now looking back, some think it was the Nazis. They claimed it was a communist plot against the state and asked that the Reichstag give Hitler emergency powers, allowing him to eliminate all human rights to get total control and authority over the nation. This is the last election that will be held in Germany until the end of World War II. Still, though, the Nazis only earned 44% of the vote. So Hitler then passed the Enabling Act, which gave his party emergency powers to govern the state and combined the authority of the chancellor and the president into one title, and that title is the Führer. He banned all political parties and attacked independent trade union movements. The army was concerned about the growing power and size of the SA, which is the Nazi political army. But once he was in power, Hitler realized that SA was expendable and he needed the army. So in June 1934, Hitler organized the Night of Long Knives, where he murdered his old ally, Ernest Röhm, the leader of the SA. And the members of the German army then agreed to give their complete loyalty to the new German state. He created a Ministry of Propaganda, and it was led by Joseph Goebbels. Huge organizations like the Hitler Youth was used to indoctrinate children, and he silenced political opposition and intimidated anyone who dissented. At the same time, we see Western democracies are, in crisis. Great Britain and France. Spain is about to launch and go through a civil war. So by 1930, democracy is faltering in almost all of the new states that were created post-World War I, except for Czechoslovakia. In Great Britain, we see the emergence of the Labour Party, which will supplant the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party was more comfortable with the Victorian world as opposed to the events of World War I. But the Labour Party was more effective in voicing the concerns of the working man. Prime Minister David Lloyd George said he would make the country fit for heroes, but England was filled with high unemployment, urban slums, numerous labor disputes throughout the 20s and 30s. In France, they had recaptured Alsace-Lorraine, but World War I only diverted attention from economic and social tensions and didn't solve the problems. The Great Depression spurred radicalization of French groups. In February 1934, a right-wing riot looked like it was going to take over the French Republic. So a number of parties on the center and left began to work together to form something called the Popular Front to block fascism in France. The Popular Front was successful when a coalition of communists, socialists, and radicals won a majority in the Chamber of Deputies. Now, despite the names, these were really just left of center people. They selected Leon Blum to be prime minister, and he was the leader of the Socialist Party. And they passed something called the Maginot Agreement. This allowed workers to collectively bargain. It set up a 40-hour work week, and it gave the right to fully paid vacations. Spain, on the other hand, is going to be in trouble during the 30s. In 1931, it had become a parliamentary democracy with the fall of the monarch. A coalition of liberals and socialists ruled, but the new government had trouble finding solutions to problems like landless farm laborers who were waiting for promised land reform that would break up the vast estates of the rich to give them land. The government failings were matched with aggressive actions from the parties on the far right. In February 1936, the Popular Front coalition of leftist parties won a narrow electoral victory. They attempted reforms such as land redistribution, but moved too slowly, and that was used by the far right to stage a coup. In the summer of 1936, a group of army officers led by General Francisco Franco took control of large parts of Spain with the belief that the republic would collapse. But Republican loyalists fought, and Spain was swept into a civil war. Fascist Germany and Italy lent support to test out their new armaments, which led to one of the most brutal events in history. For instance, on Market Day in the city of Guernica, German and Italian planes bombed and shot at the civilian population. France and Great Britain refused to come to the aid and promoted non-intervention. So they began to make a pact with the Soviet Union. The communists tried to destroy the allies on the left as much as the nationalists, though, and this did not help Spain. And by 1939, Franco had seized Madrid and ended the republic. Now Hitler is in power, and he begins to try to overturn the Treaty of Versailles. 1935, he begins the rearmament of Germany, and when France and Britain don't respond, he remilitarizes the Rhineland. In 1936, he creates the Rome-Berlin axis. He also has the Olympics in Berlin, which becomes a ginormous propaganda victory for Germany. The French want an aggressive response, but because they lack British support, nothing can be done. In March 1938, Germany launches the Anschluss of Austria, which was predicted in the very first sentence of Mein Kampf. Czechoslovakia is the singular success of Eastern Europe as a thriving democracy. It has a strong industrial base and a strong army, but they have 3.5 million Sudeten Germans who live in the western part of their lands. Britain has promised to protect them against German aggression, but they do not. Britain instead settles on a policy of appeasement. In 1937, Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister, the head of the Conservative government, thinks it's impossible to fully rearm against the combined strength of Germany and Italy and wants to work out a deal. Appeasement begins with British recognition of Italy's annexation of Ethiopia and Austria's Anschluss. They meet in Munich for the Munich Conference with France, Italy, and Germany, and they decide to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia, who was not invited. The Munich Agreement led to the transfer of all Sudeten territories to Germany, and Hitler had promised to respect the rest of Czechoslovakia. But 1 year later, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia and turns his eye to Poland, which is born out of the Treaty of Versailles, but had also been part of Germany. With the fall of Czechoslovakia, Neville Chamberlain works out an agreement with France where both nations agree to respond if Poland is threatened. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact, and the door is open for Germany to take Poland. While the Soviets take Eastern Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, all the land Russia had lost during the First World War. On September 1st, 1939, Poland is attacked by German Blitzkrieg, and within a month, the Polish army is defeated. In the winter of 1939 to 1940, we have a nickname for this period of time called the Phony War because nothing happened. But no, it is not phony. And in April of 1940, Germany attacks Norway and Denmark to gain iron ore. They then in May begin the invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands on their way towards the ultimate goal of France. France falls in just 6 short weeks. Blitzkrieg and the quick defeat of the Scandinavian nations bred pessimism amongst the French political and military leadership. During the interwar period, they had built the Maginot Line to protect soldiers, but the Germans just bypassed these as they were not extended into the Belgian frontier and encircled the French army. The British staged a heroic retreat from the Belgian beaches at Dunkirk, where every available British ship was used to take the British army and the French army out so they could fight another day. The new French government formed under the elderly Marshal Pétain. France pulled out of the war and created a more authoritative French government. His Vichy regime brought an end to the Third Republic. Charles de Gaulle will arrive in London and will issue a call for French forces in the colonies to keep fighting, and he will form a new French army to fight. The Vichy authorities will label de Gaulle a traitor. They begin to assist the Germanies, but a free French force will flourish under de Gaulle's leadership. In France, the French resistance, or Maquis, will fight against the Germans and the Vichy state. Hitler believes that Britain shares traits with German Aryans and thinks that the British would see the folly of their ways after the fall of France and simply fall in love with Germany. Winston Churchill, who will replace Chamberlain as prime minister, though, is committed to his nation and rises them through a series of stirring speeches to continue the war no matter what, giving his famous never surrender speech. Hitler will attack in the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe will attack, but the British will use radar developed by Cambridge University and the code they had cracked using the Enigma code. Britain also had better leadership than the German Air Force. The Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was actually led by a morphine addict named Hermann Göring, who decided to begin to attack British cities and actually stopped his effective raids on British air bases. Now, these bombs will create tremendous suffering in the cities, but it will allow the Royal Air Force time to recover. In September 1940, Hitler drops the plan to invade Britain and turn towards instead to Russia. Now, when we look at the Holocaust, understand this did not begin suddenly. Anti-Semitism has always been at the heart of Nazi ideology. Upon taking power, Hitler implemented the Nuremberg laws, which deprived Jews of citizenship, and he forced them to wear the Star of David. He forbade marriage and sex acts between Jews and Gentiles. Some Jews left Germany immediately, but many refused, thinking things could not get any worse. Slowly, German Jews were forced out of all professions and had their stores boycotted and their property confiscated. In November 1938, Nazis launched Kristallnacht, where several hundred people were killed and 30,000 Jews were shipped to concentration camps. When Russians were putting up stiff resistance and Germany was not able to defeat them, they still chose to direct resources that could have been used in the war effort to exterminate European Jews. They organized the final solution, and by 1941, they were using mobile vans or poisoning people with carbon monoxide gas or machine guns by SS troops, but it still wasn't efficient enough. So in June 1942, top leadership met at Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin, to plan a more efficient way to slaughter the Jews. The Nazis organized camps throughout Poland, including concentration camps and extermination camps, some of the most famous being Auschwitz. Also in the camps placed were not just Jews, but were Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Russian prisoners of war, communists, and others considered by the Nazis to be quote unquote undesirable. Now we have something called Yad Vashem. This is the Holocaust Museum in Israel, and it has a special row of trees to honor those Gentiles who did help rescue Jews. But so many more aided the Germans in implementing the Holocaust, including the Vichy, who rounded up the Jews even before the Germans asked for their help, and in Eastern Europe, where local populations worked to exterminate the Jews themselves. World War II really has three critical turning points: the Battle of Britain, which we've described. The second is the entry of the United States. Now, this will spark new energy into the war. The United States will first land troops in Africa. In 1941, Italians will enter the war and attack North Africa. They will attempt to push the British out of Egypt and will force the Germans to come to their aid. Erwin Rommel, or Desert Fox, will make it within 60 miles of Alexandria in Egypt. We will see the Battle of El Alamein, November 1942, where the British are led by General Montgomery and push the Germans and Italians back to Tunisia. And in 1943, they will push the last of the Axis forces out of Africa. In 1943, the United States will send troops to Italy, which will be knocked out of the war. They will meet at the Tehran Conference in 1943, where Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt will then sit down to discuss D-Day. And on June 6, 1944, the Allies will launch an invasion, predominantly with American troops, and this will begin the beginning of the forces sent and launched on the shores of Normandy. We will also see the ending of the siege of Leningrad, and this will be the ending of the Nazis. A third turning point will be Operation Barbarossa, and this is one of the most important. It was June 22nd, 1941, where the Germans attacked Russia. Now, initially, they will drive deep into Russia. At the end of 1942, they will reach the outskirts of Stalingrad and Leningrad. Due to a common enemy, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union will form an unlikely alliance. On May 8th, 1945, Germany will surrender unconditionally. The United States will then drop atomic bombs on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on August 14th, Japan will surrender. When we look at the aftermath, World War II is more destructive than World War I. Civilian casualties make up the majority of the 50 to 60 million people who die. In fact, in the Soviet Union, up to 25 million civilians died alone. Complete cities are leveled: Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and the firebombing of Dresden. In German cities, rubble ladies, or the Trümmerfrauen, there's no men there. So these women work with no men and no machinery to begin to move the wreckage of these cities simply by hand. In 1945, the roads are clogged with displaced people, including Jews who had survived the death camps but couldn't go home, but had nowhere else to go. Russian POWs of the Soviet Union returned just to face rearrest because Stalin thought their failure to die in battle meant they were spies, or they saw too much of Western life to be happy in the Soviet Union. Millions of Germans went west trying to escape the Soviet Union, who was exacting revenge. Also, they were forced from their homes of Poland and Czechoslovakia, which they had gained under Hitler and his Lebensraum. The Allies agreed Germany had to go through denazification, and as the perpetrators of the war crimes had to be punished. The concept of crimes against humanity was first issued, and it applied to the defendants in the Nuremberg trials, which lasted from November 1945 to October 1946. Hitler and Goebbels will not be there. They commit suicide. Hermann Göring will not be there. He kills himself with poison he had snuck into a cell. 11 others, though, will be there and sentenced to death. Many others will be sentenced to life in prison or terms in prison. But there are others that escape justice, fleeing to the Middle East and South America. People like Dr. Joseph Mengele and Adolf Eichmann. Now, Eichmann will eventually be found and brought to justice, but Mengele will never be found. West Germans refer to 1945 as 0 hour, the darkest point in their national history. When we speak about European stability, it all actually begins in 1941 with Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and the Atlantic Charter. It's there these two men sit on a boat and discuss what they want post-war Europe to look like. Here they create and lay out the plan for the United Nations. They base it in New York City to ensure the United States will be involved, unlike the League of Nations after World War I. And in July 1945, the United States Senate will ratify the agreement, showing the United States will not be returning to isolationism. Germany and Italy discredit fascism as a political movement due to the level of destruction brought to their nations. The emergence of democratic governments carried out policies that improved the economic conditions of their citizens and began to emerge things like full employment, living wages, and social welfare. But at the time, we also, just as we see the end of the war, we see the rise at the exact same time of the Cold War. Now, three major schools of thought speak about the causes of the Cold War. We have the traditionalists, we have the revisionists, and we have the post-revisionists, and each has their idea of why this emerged. So the traditionalists are those that emerge in the earliest days of the Cold War, and they say the Soviet Union is under brutal dictatorships of Stalin, and they alone are responsible for these hostilities. The revisionists of the 1960s fear post-war economic downturns, and they say that the United States is not making the world safe for democracy, but instead making it safe for American trade. So they believe that it's really the United States responsible in some ways. Then the post-revisionists of the 1980s say that even if the USSR bears responsibility, the United States is also to blame. And they kind of say that both powers are responsible. Today, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has emerged a new view. It's called the neo-traditionalist point of view. The Cold War rivalry was inevitable. Although cooperation existed, there was mistrust, and that played a role, ranging from Soviet anger over a delay in the opening of the Second Front, and that the British and Americans were seeking ways to negotiate separate peace terms with Germany. Now, the Yalta Conference is where the Big Three agrees to temporarily, this is what happens near the very, very end of World War II, they agree to temporarily divide Germany into 4 zones with an Allied Control Council to make joint decisions. The Soviets gain control over political life and its zone by subverting democratic structures. This allows for the reestablishment of all non-right-wing parties that existed in the Weimar Republic. Walter Ulbricht is who the Soviets elect to lead the German Communist Party, or KPD. He thought his party would get genuine support, but mass rape, the dismantling of factories that were sent back to the Soviet Union, and the failure of land reform led the Germans to be quite angry with the Soviets. In 1946, Ulbricht forced a merger between his KPD and the Social Democratic Party to create a one-party state. Tensions were also growing over reparations that were leveled at $20 billion, and that had been established at Yalta. At Potsdam, there was a negotiation that said each occupying power could collect the reparations, with the Soviets receiving 25% of the amount collected by the other 3 due to the extensive damage that was done to the Soviet Union during World War II. But the Allies in the West began to fear that this would destroy the German economy and that the Americans and British would then have to feed the Germans. So on his very own in May 1946, General Lucius Clay, commander of the American zone, ended the collection of reparations, which was then quickly followed by the other 2 zones, and all the money stopped flowing to the Soviet Union. Now there is increased tensions happening. In 1941, the Soviets and British jointly divided and occupied Iran with an agreement they would both leave at the end of the war. But in 1945, the British left and the Soviets refused. They needed the oil. Truman heard the Soviets were in Tehran, so he sent warships into the Persian Gulf, and Stalin responded by removing his troops. Turkey, which was neutral during World War II, was intimidated by Stalin as he tried to get naval bases along the Strait to give the Soviets access to the Mediterranean. And he began to leave troops along their border. He only withdrew again when he realized the United States would be willing to fight to protect Turkey. The United States foreign policy at this time is in flux with the death of FDR and the replacement of him by no-nonsense Harry Truman, who did not like Stalin. He was quite firm with him. And then finally, a policy began to influence the United States and what they would do. It was the writings of George Kennan in his long telegram. It was written in 1947. And he said the Soviets were our ideological enemy and that we could not coexist and that we needed to contain the spread of communism. And so that becomes the foreign policy of the United States, which ends up being the competing policies of the Cold War. Containment is first tested in Greece, where communists led insurgents fighting against the new Greek government. In Britain, 1947, they said they could no longer support the Greeks and that they would fall. So Truman issued a speech, the joint session of Congress in March 1947, and issued his Truman Doctrine that said it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples or resisting attempted subjugation, and asked for money to be given to both Greece and Turkey, reaching $400 million. The United States decided to counter the Soviet threat in Eastern Europe by establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. Numerous nations joined, including Turkey and Greece, by 1952. The Soviets, though, have dominance over Eastern Europe. In 1944, at the end of World War II, they are advancing through Eastern Europe. Now, Winston Churchill will travel to Moscow and meet Stalin and present him with the Percentages Agreement that divided various nations of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence based on percentages. The agreement, though, was flawed, as Poland was left out entirely, and the United States simply refused to accept such an agreement. At the war's end, Stalin expected to control the future of all the areas the Red Army had liberated at the end of World War II. He wanted to create a protective shield from any future invasion. They met in Yalta on the Crimea Sea, where the British and the Americans were able to get the Soviets to accept the declaration of a liberated Europe. Stalin said these countries would have free elections in Eastern Europe, yet by Potsdam, that agreement is dead. Churchill will later claim that an iron curtain has descended across the continent when free elections are violated. Now, in Poland, Stalin had planned to create a government dominated by Polish communists, but said that an undetermined number of anti-communist Poles in London could be added to the provisional government when he was at Yalta. Roosevelt, during this time, is accused of selling out Poland. The Soviets had troops on the ground, and there was little anyone could do about it. The promised elections were finally held under conditions of intimidation in 1947, and the communists won a resounding 80% of the vote. The Soviets had used force to maintain communism because they were hated, and it only got worse when the role of this was revealed with the murder of 15,000 Polish officers in the forest of Katyn at the start of the war. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe, the rest of Eastern Europe hoped to control, Stalin hoped to control the rest of Eastern Europe without violence. Economic and social failures of this region during the entire war, though, caused this to be difficult. Very few advocated the return of politics of the past. And in Eastern Europe, the Soviets were viewed as liberators from the horrors of the Germans. With the exception of Poland, the Soviet Union tried to establish people's democracies in Eastern Europe. These were governments filled with more proletarian than bourgeoisie, but not fully communist. There was a push for tighter control of Eastern Europe, and this was in reaction to the offer of the Marshall Plan money to all the nations of Europe. Stalin saw this as a threat to Soviet control over places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In Hungary, communists practiced salami tactics. This is intimidation and false plots against non-communist leaders to cut them out of the political situation. Using these tactics, the Hungarian Communist Party forced its competitors, the small party, out of existence by 1948 and won a fraudulent election in 49 with a resounding 95% of the vote. In Czechoslovakia, so again, in Czechoslovakia, this was a different situation than elsewhere. Immediately following the war, government was dominated by President Eduard Beneš, a non-communist who understood the necessity of a pro-Soviet foreign policy. The Czechs were more favorably disposed towards the Soviet Union, who they saw as liberators, and felt they frankly owed nothing to the West, who sold them out in Munich in 1938. Pressure was put on his government by Czech communists who formed the People's Militia and intimidated him into creating a new government dominating by communists. Then the body of former minister Jan Masaryk, son of the founder of Czechoslovakia, was found outside his window. We don't know if it was through suicide or murder, but it was clear that the multi-party Czechoslovakia was coming to an end. Social Democrats forcibly were absorbed into the Communist Party, and they controlled elections so that by 1948, the communists had won complete victory. In Yugoslavia, this is a major exception to Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Resistance was based on a broad alliance against brutal Croatian puppet governments created by the Germans. As the war continued, a civil war broke out amongst partisan groups, with the communists led by a man named Josip Broz Tito. There were numerous fights against the royalists during this time. The civil war ended with the triumph of Tito's communists, but Stalin didn't trust Tito because of the assistance he got during the war from both the British and the Americans. And Stalin didn't like an indigenous communist movement that he personally couldn't control. Relations were poor between the two countries, and by 1948, a formal break took place. Still at home, Tito maintained a brutal communist-style police state. All right, this takes us to the end of imperialism. This is an effect of World War II. So the British wanted to maintain their empire after the war, but the United States did not want them to. And frankly, the British were dependent on the Americans for loans. They couldn't afford to hold the colonies. And we see the beginning of decolonization begin to take place in August of 1947, when India declares its independence, which initiates a domino effect throughout the rest of the British Empire. In 1947, Britain announces withdrawing from Palestine, leaving it to the United Nations to be in charge. The demands for a Jewish homeland or Zionism is growing louder due to the Holocaust. But Arabic nationalist sentiments are also increasing. In response, the United Nations agrees to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab homeland. In May 1948, the Jewish state of Israel was founded and then immediately attacked by its Arab neighbors, but the small Jewish state wins. Britain had a significant influence in Egypt, even though Egypt had been independent since 1944. This changes when Abdul Nasser becomes president. In 1956, he announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal as he is upset over US and Soviet funding for the Aswan Dam. In response, the British, French, and Israel plan an attack on Egypt, but the United States and the Soviet Union make them back down. The British begin a process of decolonization during this time also of sub-Saharan Africa. In 1957, Ghana declares its independence, which is followed by Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Uganda, and Kenya, all which had very few British settlers, so their independence was quite easy. But in Rhodesia in 1965, a large number of British settlers were there, and they formed their own white supremacist government and declared their independence from Britain. It would not be until 1980 that Africans would win control of the land and rename it Zimbabwe. France and the Netherlands had a very poor military record in World War II, so holding on to their colonies seemed to be important to them to restore their sense of honor. The Dutch tried to maintain costly colonies in the East Indies, but by 1949 agreed to recognize Indonesia independence. France also tried hard to hold Algeria, as more than 1 million native French lived there. They almost broke into a civil war until 1958 when Charles de Gaulle took over the French government and granted Algerian independence. They also lost a bitter war in Indochina, where the nationalist movement under Ho Chi Minh was fought against the French, and by 1954, the French lose and Vietnam is divided into 2 states. Now, at this time, we are going to see the rise of an organization that will eventually become what we see as the European Union. The French want a pan-European cooperation organization because they believe it will keep an eye on their traditional enemy, Germany. Also, there's a need to end wasteful competition and ease tensions throughout the nations of Europe. There's also concern of the Soviet Union, which led to military cooperation through the creation of NATO, and this aids European unity. The first stage of creating economic cooperation was by the creation of the Organization for the European Economic Cooperation called the OEEC. They had the task of handling the money provided by the United States through the Marshall Plan. The United States insisted the money be used in a cooperative manner. It also was used to work to lower tariffs and eliminate trade barriers among states getting assistance. The next stage in development was the creation in 1951 of the European Coal and Steel Community called the ECSC. They combined and administered the steel and coal resources of their member nations, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. They also created a separate national assembly to guide the ECSC, which they renamed the European Parliament in 1962. They created a court of justice, and they started to direct the income of the community in the form of taxes. In 1957, they signed the Treaty of Rome, which creates the European Economic Community or Common Market. Britain, Ireland, and Denmark joined in 1973. They lift almost all trade restrictions among their member nations. In 1986, they revised the treaty with the European Single Act, which provides for free movement of capital, labor, and services like banking and insurance. And in 1992, they signed the Maastricht Treaty. This creates common currency, the euro, with coins and banknotes going into circulation in January 2002. The only nations not using the euro were Denmark, Sweden, and the UK. This began a new era of cooperation in defense and justice and the environment, and they changed the name from the EEC to the European Union. The EU has undergone a lot of expansion in the number of its member states. The largest entrance of groups actually was in 2004. Many were former members of the Warsaw Pact or part of the Soviet Union. Turkey's EU bid actually began in 2005, and it's been quite controversial. It's not accepted yet, and some doubt it will ever be able to meet the economic targets required to join. Others question its commitment to human rights, and some express concern, admitting a Muslim state into the EU with a large Muslim population could change what they consider the fabric of Europe. EU expansion has led to a desire to make all of them work together more efficiently, and many tried to write a European constitution with a caveat that all EU members had to approve it to go into effect. France, though, voted no in May 2005 in a national referendum. Then we see in 2016, Great Britain approved Brexit, or with the withdrawal of the UK, which causes them to leave the EU on January 31st, 2020. It's the only country to have ever left the EU. Increased tensions and resurgence of nationalism throughout Europe has made it clear that further European integration is on hold for the foreseeable future.